Elsbeth was gone again, and I was alone again. Over the past few years, her trips to see our daughter Sharon seemed to increase in frequency. Sharon and Elsbeth got along much better alone than Sharon and I did. I've never been able to figure out why. When Sharon was little, I treated her like a princess. In fact, I spoiled her to no end. I think that was my big mistake. I tried too hard. When she was about 16, our relationship went south and her relationship with her mother improved. Now they were together at every opportunity. I never realized what had happened or what I had done wrong. Although I grew up in Chesterton, I never liked the place, so I lived 600 miles away. My daughter, Sharon, and her family were still there. I only had bad memories of my old hometown. The time I spent in school was unforgettable. I wasn't studious enough to socialize with the nerds, I wasn't athletic enough to hang out with the jocks, and I wasn't pretty enough to hang out with the party people. I was one of the invisible kids. Elsbeth, of course, was one of the popular girls I couldn't relate to. I watched her from afar but never hoped to get close to her or any of the other girls in her group. She dated one of the athletes, Bobby Keisler, until he left town for college. At the same time, I went to the local community college, and that's where I met Elsbeth. Elsbeth was taking some sort of course in food management, and I was in a 2-year program to become an accountant. I won't bore you with the details, but a year later, when Elsbeth found out that Bobby was engaged to a girl from his college, we started dating. The next year, we were married. I was too naive to realize I was being used and too ecstatic about my good fortune. Guys like me never marry girls like Elsbeth. Shortly after we were married, my son Rob was born, and then my daughter Sharon. Speaking of Rob, he now lives in Colorado. My relationship with Rob was similar to the one I had with Sharon. I was always a good father and tried to be a friend, but things went south around the same time as with his sister. No matter what I did, it pissed them off, or at least turned them against me. Like I said, I didn't have a clue. We stayed in Chesterton until both kids graduated from high school. Rob left town right away. Sharon married her childhood sweetheart and stayed. A great job opportunity in Nashville presented itself to me, and I accepted in a heartbeat. Elsbeth came with me, but kicked and screamed the whole way. Elsbeth and I had been married for about 15 years when Bobby Keisler came back to town. He had married his college sweetheart and had come home to take over his father's business. Elsbeth was both glad and not glad to have him back. I think she was glad to have him back, but not glad to have his beautiful wife, and she was a beauty. After his return, the next 4 years were intense for me. The relationship between Elsbeth and I began to deteriorate, and about the same time the children began to drift away from me. One strange thing I remember was that Sharon seemed to grow closer to Elsbeth, while Rob grew distant from both of us. I was an accountant. I hated things that didn't add up. The next year, I was going to surprise Elsbeth with a trip to Italy for our 25th anniversary. The last 5 years in Nashville had been just awful. I thought she would enjoy living in such an interesting city. But all she wanted to do was go back and see Sharon. She never once mentioned going to Colorado to see Rob and his family. It gave the impression that she was spending more time with her daughter than her husband. The first thing she would do when she got home would be to start planning the next trip. The only good thing about Elsbeth's trips to Chesterton was that she never tried to talk me into going with her. I was perfectly fine with that. My parents had moved to Florida, and the only connection to Chesterton for me was the internet. Every day, I checked the website to see if anyone had died. I know it sounds a little ridiculous, but I took a strange pleasure in it. Friday morning, I got an unexpected phone call from Sharon. She rarely called me, especially when Elsbeth was with her. "Daddy, we have a little problem. Mom fell and broke her ankle." Oh, shit. How did that happen? Is she okay? "She's fine, Dad. She tripped over a dog last night and broke her ankle when she landed. You don't have to worry or rush over here or anything. Mom's staying with us until the doctor says she's okay to go. I'll drive her home and fly back." "Okay, if you say so. How long do you think it will take?" "Probably 2 or 3 weeks or so. She's sedated now, but I'll have her call you when the medication wears off." "Are you sure you don't need anything? How are you going to pay the doctor's bills?" "Our insurance will cover everything. It's okay. Don't worry." Sharon hung up the phone, and I sat in deep thought for another long time. Something was wrong, but I couldn't figure out what it was. I sat down in front of my computer with a cup of hot coffee and started looking through the obituaries. All of the deceased, as usual, were strangers. For some reason, instead of closing the obituary page, I went to the local news. Funny how your life can change from one keystroke. The headline read, "Local resident killed in house fire." The story turned out to be even more interesting. Robert Keisler died in an early morning fire that turned out to have been started by a malfunctioning heater. Mr. Keisler died in his bedroom from carbon monoxide caused by the fire. Another resident of the home suffered a fractured ankle after jumping from the second-floor roof. The victim was transported to community hospital by the Keystone Rescue Squad. I found it interesting that the article did not mention the name of the second occupant, but indicated that it was a woman. The rest of the article was general background information about Bobby. True, it did mention that his wife, Audrey, died of ovarian cancer about 4 years ago. It took less than a minute to get the phone number for the Keystone Rescue Squad. "Hello, this is James Pearson. I understand my wife was hurt last night and you guys helped her out. I'd like to know how much we owe you and how I can pay for the services." That was a strong possibility. Hell, I might even have been wrong, but what did I have to lose? I figured they'd be more than happy to give me the information since I wanted to pay. "I assume you mean Elsbeth Pearson, is that correct?" "Yes, that's right. How much do I owe you and where can I send a check, or do you accept credit cards?" "Mr. Pearson, it looks like you don't owe. The bill has already been paid in full by Sharon Dietrich." "That's my sister-in-law. I assume everything is in order then?" "Exactly. Thank you for calling, and I'm glad we were able to help you." That pretty much confirmed the conspiracy that existed between my wife and daughter. All those trips back and forth were just so Elsbeth and Bobby could be together. The fact that my daughter seemed to know about it and went along with it was even more painful. I would have a hard time forgiving her. I had no idea how long Elsbeth had been seeing Kessler, but I guessed it started shortly after his wife died. It was right around the time we moved to Nashville. Coffee was replaced by cold beer. I needed to think. Nothing was coming together anyway. Sharon and Elsbeth had started this strange bond long before we moved to Tennessee. I'd missed something. Rob was due back from work in about 2 hours. We hadn't talked too much over the past few years, but I felt the need to probe him a little. Maybe he could help fill in a few empty spots. I never finished that long neck. By the next sip, the beer was lukewarm. I really didn't need a beer right now. I sat for 2 hours thinking about my marriage. As marriages go, it was pretty shitty. Of course, the only thing I had to compare it to was my parents and what I'd seen on TV. Elsbeth kept the house in order and knew how to cook. She never turned me down sex, but for the last few years I wasn't interested. It wasn't about the physical component, but the personal relationship that had to go along with it. I still wanted and needed sex, but I was no longer attracted to Elsbeth. We never seemed to connect with each other, and now I realize why. I didn't see her cheating as a disaster, but rather as an opportunity. Her cheating helped me realize why we had drifted apart. Now that Bobby was dead, I was a little puzzled as to why she didn't want to come home as soon as possible. I figured she realized that the longer she waited, the less likely I would be able to connect the dots. The longer she hides from me that she broke her ankle at the same time Bobby died, the better chance she has of hiding it. It was time to call Colorado. "Rob, it's Dad. Listen, I'm sorry to bother you, but I was hoping you could help me with a few questions." "Sure, Dad. What do you need to know?" There was no enthusiasm in his voice. "Rob, a few years ago when you and Sharon were younger, we seemed to get along a lot better. But all of a sudden things went south. I've never been able to figure out what happened that made you two change. Is there anything you can share with me? I'd really like to know." A sigh was heard on the other end. "I don't know, Dad. I guess we've just grown distant from each other. Sharon and I are going through those rambunctious years, you know." I realized that this phone conversation was going to be a waste, so I decided it was best to end it and start looking elsewhere for answers. "Okay, Rob. If that's all you've got, I'll leave it at that. I just found out that your mother has been cheating on me and has been for several years now. I was just wondering if it had anything to do with family difficulties." "I don't understand." It's not complicated, Rob. Infidelity, adultery, breaking marital vows, it shouldn't be too difficult to understand. No, not that, Dad. You said you just found out. What does that mean? It's pretty simple, too. I just discovered this morning that your mother has been having sex with an ex-boyfriend for years. Oh, shit, that little bitch. She set me up. Care to explain? It happened years ago when we were still in high school. Sharon and I came home early one day and caught Mom having sex with a guy in your bedroom. I jumped out of the house, but Mom stopped Sharon and talked to her. Later, I told Sharon that we should tell you as soon as you got home, and she said we couldn't. Why did she do that? Sharon told me that Mom told her that you were no longer able to do your conjugal duties in the bedroom, so you arranged for her to meet with that guy to do the job for you. Sharon said Mom said that? That's right. I know it seems a little far-fetched now, but Sharon insisted we not tell you because if you found out we knew, you'd be humiliated. So that's why you didn't say anything? Of course. I didn't know who to be angrier at, you or Mom. Now I think Sharon might have been part of it, too. You kept quiet for 2 years until you could leave? Yeah, sounds pretty stupid when I think about it. Hey, if you want to see stupid, look at me. It must have been almost 10 years before I found out. I'm the stupid one. Dad, how did you find out about it? Your mother was sleeping in his house when it caught fire. He died in an accident, and your mother broke her ankle jumping out the window. How did you find out about that? It's a little complicated. Let's just say things seem to be clearing up now. I'm sorry, Dad. I didn't know. Don't worry about it. You can make it up to me later. By the way, don't call your sister and let her know I know. I think she's in on the whole thing along with your mother. I'm sure she does. Let me know what I can do to help. I owe you a great debt of gratitude. I wasn't going to confront my wife about any of this. I did what I had to do and moved on with my life. One thing I realized very quickly. There would be no divorce. I absolutely refused to give her half of everything just because the state told me to. There was no benefit in divorce, especially if I lived abroad. I decided it was best not to disturb Elsbeth during her period of mourning. She had lost her lover. It would be insensitive of me to intrude on her emotions at this time. I chuckled slightly to myself upon hearing these thoughts. I did, however, take the time to get my finances in order. It took less than a week to get everything in order. The only one that might have stuck was the bank that held the mortgage on the house. I tried to sign a quick title transfer agreement for them to make the repossession process easier for them. They refused and insisted that I honor my commitment or they would sue me. I just smiled and walked out the door. The realization that my credit history would be ruined didn't bother me in the slightest. In fact, I found it mildly amusing. It's amazing how much money you can raise if you put in the effort. I had over $480,000 to take with me. Within a week, I hadn't heard from Sharon and Elsbeth. I realized that their deliberate effort to avoid me had strengthened my resolve. I had a passport and enough money to live comfortably for at least 20 years. After that, I would have to rely on the Social Security benefits to which I would still be entitled or the generosity of rich women. Of course, the second part of this theory was just wishful thinking. I had no trouble finding a small apartment in Cagliari, Sardinia. It wasn't that close to the city center, but that didn't matter to me. There were plenty of small stores and restaurants within walking distance. I didn't speak Italian, but I didn't seem to have any trouble communicating. I was sure it would get easier as time went on. I had no idea what made me choose Sardinia, but I was glad I had made the choice. After opening a bank account, I applied for a residency permit and then bought a mailbox from a store nearby. Unfortunately, I felt the need to have a few ties to the States. The biggest obligation that still rested on my shoulders was last year's income tax. I could not jeopardize my pending Social Security with unpaid taxes. That one prick of conscience and insecurity threatened to cause me problems down the road. For about 6 months, things went well. I was able to gather all the necessary tax information and file on time. I was relieved that the IRS cashed my check made out to an Italian bank. Life was good. All the vendors and waiters knew my name and my preferences. I had acquired a small laptop computer and enjoyed using the free local Wi-Fi. I learned to play dominoes and bocce. I no longer had a need for a rented mailbox, but I didn't give it up. I decided I would just wait until the end of the year and let the lease expire. It was right next to the apartment, so checking it once a week or so was no problem. It was a bright spring day and the piazza was crowded. I walked into the post office to do my weekly check when I heard her. "Hello, James. You're hard to find." Elsbeth looked good, but a little older and a little tired. I smiled at my wife. I didn't want to be rude, but I also didn't want her to think I was happy to see her. This was a difficult situation that I hadn't anticipated or planned for. "You're looking well. I see your ankle is healed." It was corny, and I know it sounded unnatural and insincere. As we left the store, I looked back across the piazza and saw Sharon about 100 yards away on the other side of the square. She was wearing a swooping hat and sunglasses, like a ridiculous cliché from 60s movies. A few feet away from her was a small cafe. We took a table in the warm sunshine near the front door. "Would you like coffee? With cream and no sugar, right?" Elsbeth smiled at me and nodded, sitting down. She seemed relieved to get a response from me at all. I don't know what she was expecting. I walked into the store to place my order, but instead headed straight for the back door. By this time, the owner and I were on pretty good terms, and he seemed to notice that something was going on. I smiled and pointed to the table near the entrance where Elsbeth was sitting. He looked over, smiled back, and nodded as I disappeared out the door. A few minutes later, I was standing on the second-floor balcony of one of my favorite restaurants, discreetly looking around the square. No one would have noticed me if they hadn't been looking up. She waited long and patiently, but finally got up and went inside. I couldn't tell for sure, but I think she cried when she came back out. Sharon rushed over to her, and a small, emotional conversation took place between them. I waited a few more minutes and went back to the apartment. They knew about the mail delivery, but there was no way they could know where I lived. For the next 3 days, I watched them return to the piazza. Twice a day, they would sit and wait, and then it stopped. I was relieved that I had avoided a confrontation, but worried about the future. I think some would have considered me a coward, since I didn't want to talk to her. But I didn't see it that way. Besides money, there were 2 things she might want. I was determined to give her neither, and I was well aware that there would be no financial arrangement. I am now in Bastia, Corsica. Although it is a French city, the neighborhood where I live is mostly Italian. I liked it in Sardinia, but now I don't feel comfortable there. I am pleased with myself because I have changed my lifestyle so that my money is enough for a long time. I find new interests every day, and some of the local ladies are starting to become friends with me. Yes, I am still married, but I have decided that I have a few more years of free time ahead of me. I'm getting old, but I'm not dead. Rob knows where I am. He and his family are planning a vacation to the Mediterranean next summer, and I'm looking forward to it. Epilogue. Rob and his family spent Christmas with Elsbeth at Sharon's house. Things escalated to a head when Rob told his sister about the deception. Sharon's husband, Mark, listened to the argument with interest, and 6 months later divorced my daughter. I wonder why. Elsbeth never filed for divorce. I guess she's waiting for me to come back. Rob was more than happy to tell me about his visit.